session, The Mechanics of Why Trees Break and the Preventative Pruning Strategies with Dr. Brian Kane. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Kane, who's an ISA Certified Arborist. He is a professor of arboriculture with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's been working in the industry for over 30 years. His research focuses on tree worker safety and how practices like pruning, cabling, and rigging affect the likelihood of tree failure. He has published more than 60 scholarly papers on these topics. Dr. Kane has received the ISA Early Career Scientist Award, the Shigo Award for Excellence in Arboricultural Research and Education, and the ISA President's Award for dedicated service to the industry. And I'm pleased to say he is a fellow former ISA board member of mine and a good buddy. So I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Kane. Go ahead and share your screen, Dr. Kane.
Thank you very much, Ann. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you all for being here today. And hopefully, the presentation will go reasonably well. I know that it's always nicer to do these sorts of things in person, but we're going to have to make the best of it under the circumstances. So hopefully this will be a good learning experience. There's plenty of time at the end of this presentation for questions, and so Ann's going to field those questions at the end, and then hopefully we'll have a nice back and forth. Most of you hopefully are not familiar with the images on the screen here from the sense of being part of a tree failure. So this is a friend of mine who lives in Amherst, and you can see on the bottom image is this branch of a white pine, and go back one slide, and on the top image is the rest of that branch that's down on the floor. So my friend was literally sitting working at his computer when this white pine failed and punched a hole right through the roof. And suffice it to say, he stopped very quickly what he was doing, and I think scared the you-know-what out of him before he was able to run outside and kind of take a look and survey the damage. So this is something that has real-life consequences. Any arborist who's ever worked in risk assessment knows that. And so hopefully we'll get some good information about an important topic and how arborists can address this issue of likelihood of failure through pruning. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge the people who have helped make this presentation possible. So there's actually a huge list of people who have worked on the various research projects that are part of today's presentation. And I really wouldn't be able to be here if it weren't for their help. They helped me collect data, analyze data, and so forth. And so I'm grateful to all of them for the effort they have expended. I also need to acknowledge the funding sources that made this presentation possible. So the Tree Fund has been very kind to me in terms of research grants. I've been very fortunate to have their support. And of course, the Massachusetts Arborists Association has an endowment at the University of Massachusetts, which basically pays my salary. So I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for the Mass Arborist. So I have to make sure that all of these people and organizations get their due credit. Some quick contact information. If you need to get a hold of me, if you don't get your question answered today, or if you think of a question, sometime in the future, don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm happy to respond, have conversation about things. I've got a YouTube page that includes some of the presentations that I'm going to use, some of the video clips that I have embedded in the PowerPoint today. There's also videos of other research projects we've worked on. And then if you're a social media person, UMass has a presence on Facebook and Instagram. We frequently post updates on research, on career opportunities, and that sort of thing. So if you want to stay current on what's going on back in New England, then by all means you can hook up with us there. just as an introduction for the rest of the presentation, I want to kind of give an overview of the key points, the most important things that I hope people get out of today's presentation. The first thing is this kind of relatively straightforward statement about tree failure. And a tree is a structure just like any engineered structure. It has to obey the laws of physics. And some of those laws, when we apply them to a situation like, is this tree going to fail? There's a very simple way of thinking about this. It turns out in detail, it's actually really complicated, but it's a very straightforward statement that a failure of any structure is going to occur when the loads on that structure exceed its load-bearing capacity. When we think about defects, which is a common thing that we're looking at when we're doing risk assessments, defects increase the likelihood of failure because they decrease the load-bearing capacity. And then the third important point that we'll cover in the last third of the presentation is that arborists regularly prune trees to try to reduce the likelihood of failure. So they can't really adjust the load-bearing capacity by pruning, but they can change some of these other parameters that relate to the load. So how much wind force is there, for example, and how fast does the tree sway back and forth. So we're going to take a look at all of those aspects in the presentation today. These are kind of maybe the keystone things that we want to get across. One last introductory slide, which we call the fine print, and I don't want to shirk my responsibility for providing some hopefully helpful information, but there's a lot more than we can cover in an hour. In reality, this presentation includes 2 or 3 semesters of engineering and several research projects, a lot of background experience in pruning. We only have time to kind of scratch the surface of this. So it's important to just keep that in mind that there's a lot more to understand about this. The other thing that's important to remember, certainly in terms of your personal experience as an arborist, is that for most of the topics that we cover in this presentation, there's not a huge amount of research. So it's not like we have thousands and thousands and thousands of trees that have been tested for many, many years that provide us a kind of academic or scientific consensus on what happens. It's actually more important for you in terms of your personal practice to understand some of these basic physics concepts that we're going to cover, because that actually is going to help you apply your experience and this knowledge of some simple physics to all the possible situations that you're going to run into as a professional. So this is actually another really important thing to remember. Your experience is going to be very valuable because we don't have a huge amount of research on many of these topics. The last thing is for arborists and other practitioners who deal with trees, we have the distinct disadvantage of not being able to ignore the biology of trees, the physiology of trees. So whereas an engineer, somebody who's designing a building or a structure, can focus purely on the physics and the mathematics behind that, when we're dealing with trees, we have to definitely keep in mind that trees are living organisms, and simply focusing on the physical aspects of them, trees as structures, we run the real risk of missing out on some important biological aspects. So we have to balance that, and that's not always easy to do. Here's a list of the important mechanical concepts that are relevant for understanding the likelihood of failure. And so we're going to hopefully go through all of these. Again, this is at least a couple, if not 3 semesters of engineering classes that we're not going to be able to go into great detail. And if you have a degree in engineering, I apologize in advance because this is going to be a very quick overview. But these are all very important concepts to understand, even if just understand them intuitively, because they directly affect the likelihood of tree failure And they also directly affect how practices like pruning can reduce the likelihood of tree failure. So here's just a quick reiteration of this key concept. Failure occurs when the applied load exceeds load-bearing capacity. And so some of the research we've done actually looks at exactly this sort of thing. How much force, how much load can a tree bear when you apply it? So here's just a quick video to illustrate this. You can see there's a cable up in the top of this tree over here. We're just pulling on, this is a nice red maple, large red maple with a winch, with a skidder, a forestry skidder. We measure the amount of force it takes to break it apart. And then we do tests on trees that don't have decay. We do tests on trees that have weak unions. We also do tests on trees that have decay. Here's a classic example of failure. You can actually see some callus wood right down at the base of this tree. This tree is, almost completely hollow, and you see the way it fails. So you actually get a lot of insights into how trees behave as structures when you tear them apart like that. The load that we are going to focus on today, trees experience lots of different loads. So they're the loads of gravity, the tree's own weight, the loads of the gravity that's affecting snow or ice on a tree, climbing into a tree, that imparts a load, rigging trees, all of those are loads that trees have to bear. The one that's most relevant for today's topic is, in terms of pruning, is the load that is caused by the wind. And so the wind load, or the force of the wind, has a specific name, and it's called drag. And the equation you see on the screen here is drag is equal to 1/2 times this little P-like letter, and then A, C, D, and V squared. This is a list below of the different variables that are in that equation. So that little P-looking thing is actually the Greek letter rho, and it just signifies air density. A is for frontal area. This is, imagine taking a picture of a tree and then measuring how much area, how much leaf area was presenting itself from the front. CD is something called drag coefficient, and I have a slide next to illustrate this and distinguish it from the frontal area. But basically, drag coefficient is a measurement of how streamlined a structure is. So how easy it is for air to pass around a solid object. And the last variable that it affects drag is the velocity. So that's just symbolized by the letter V. So this slide here, I got from the NASA website. So it's the website down at the bottom here. There's actually a lot of really nice illustrations on that NASA website. The drag coefficient is this measurement of how streamlined an object is. And so what you see here is all these black shapes. So there's a flat plate, there's a sphere, there's a prism, there's a bullet, and there's an airfoil. That's just the wing of an airplane. So all of those objects have the same frontal area. When we're calculating drag, that's what the frontal area is, what you'd measure. And you can put a tree up here and it has a certain frontal area. The drag coefficient, you notice, which is it's typed in red font above or next to each one of these shapes, the drag coefficient is very, very different. And again, depending on how easy it is for air to pass around that object, that's what the drag coefficient was reflecting. So if you just have like a flat plate of steel, the drag coefficient is 1.28. Whereas if you have an airplane wing, the drag coefficient is 0.045. So it's much easier for the wind to pass around that airfoil, even though it has the exact same frontal area as this flat plate. So not going to belabor this point longer, but it is important to recognize that the shape of an object, so the shape of a tree, not just its frontal area, can have an influence on how much drag the tree experiences when the wind is blowing on it. Okay, so back to this equation for drag. There's all these factors here: air density, frontal area, drag coefficient, and velocity squared. So of these, which is the most important? Hopefully, if you look at the equation, you recognize that velocity is the most important because drag is a function of the velocity squared. So this means that for any of the other factors, like the air density, and realistically, that's not going to change very much if you're in the same place. It only changes if you go to really high elevation or really low elevation. So the air density, if you double it, then you'll double the drag. Whereas if you double the area, you'll double the drag. If you double the drag coefficient, you'll double the drag. All of those factors have a one-to-one relationship. If you increase them or decrease them, the drag will increase or decrease as a factor of 1. With velocity, the fact that that is squared means that any multiplier, so if we double the drag, multiply it by double the velocity, multiply it by 2, you have to square that, which means the drag is going to be 4 times greater if you double the velocity. And if you triple the velocity, the drag is going to be 3 times 3, 9 times greater. And if you multiply the velocity by a factor of 4, 10 miles an hour to 40 miles per hour, the drag is going to be 16 times greater. 4 times 4, 4 squared is 16. So this is a really important concept to grasp because of the factors in this equation for drag, the things that are going to affect the force of the wind. The only ones that you can affect by pruning are the area and the drag coefficient. And so if velocity, as it doubles, multiplies the drag by a function of 4 or more, you can only prune so much area out of the tree before either you prune everything out of it or you prune so much that biologically it's going to stress the tree out very, very much. So there's a threshold at which increases in velocity can't be compensated by pruning more area out of the tree. There's just no way you're going to be able to compensate for that. When the wind is blowing on a tree, there's a lever that's involved. And I'll show you a diagram of that in the next slide. The lever is basically a distance between where the wind is pushing on the tree, so up in the crown of the tree, and where the tree is being held in the ground. So that distance, we call that a lever. And whenever you have a force that acts over a lever, it's going to create something called a torque. So anyone who's used a wrench before, the probably common scenario is like if you had to take the tire off, you get a flat tire and you got to loosen the lug nuts on your car tire. You have a wrench, you exert a certain amount of force on that wrench. The torque that you generate is the amount of force times the length of the wrench. That's the lever that you're applying that force over. So wind does the exact same thing, either to an individual branch, because the branch is basically held at the base where the attachment is, or to the whole tree, because the ground is holding the whole tree in place. So when you have forces acting over a lever or a distance, you get this torque. And the torque is force multiplied by the lever. So here's a silver maple, Acer saccharinum, growing on the UMass campus. And let's just throw in some numbers here. The drag on this tree, the drag is represented by that red arrow that's facing to the right. That's 1,000 pounds. These are entirely made up numbers. But let's just pretend the drag, that force of the wind, is equal to 1,000 pounds. It's the force, remember, is acting up in the crown of the tree. And the lever, the distance between that, we just put it at the center of the crown so that it's, doesn't have to draw, I don't have to draw a million arrows on every single leaf, but let's pretend that lever is 40 feet long. So the torque that the tree experiences down at the ground is 4,000 foot-pounds. 1,000 pounds of drag times 40 feet of lever. Lever is another one of these really important physical concepts because when forces act over levers or over a distance, they get multiplied by that lever and it causes this torque. if you try to loosen the lug nuts on a tire just by holding the lug nut with your hand, it's like, good luck. Even if you had a socket wrench and you just tried to hold the socket in your hand and turn it, good luck. You absolutely need a lever. You need to generate a torque to loosen up that nut. The same effect, basically, this magnification effect, is when drag is acting on the crown of the tree. So when we've done our research on trees and measuring forces, measuring drag and torque, this video is a little grainy because it's gotten zoomed up here, but we basically took an idea that Tom Smiley came up with at the Bartlett Labs many years ago, and it's to bring the tree to the wind rather than to wait for a windy day. This is especially true in places where you don't consistently have strong winds. This is a nice way of measuring the force and measuring the torque on that tree. So we basically do that with trees before and after pruning, and then we have a nice kind of before and after comparison to see how much the pruning affects both the drag and the torque. So remember, the likelihood of failure depends on loads and load-bearing capacity. You can have a huge amount of drag, but if the tree has a huge load-bearing capacity, then it's not going to fail. So you need to understand both of those things. We're not really going to talk about load-bearing capacity in too much detail, but it is important to know a few things. And the first is that the load-bearing capacity in trees is primarily a function of the diameter of either the roots or a branch or the trunk itself. And the load-bearing capacity actually depends on the diameter cubed. So this is best illustrated if you can imagine a half-inch diameter branch versus a 2-inch diameter branch. So a 2-inch diameter branch is has a much greater load-bearing capacity. It has 4 times the diameter, so 2 divided by 1/2 is 4. And if you cube 4, you get 4 times 4 times 4, which is 16 times 4, which is 64, right? So a 2-inch diameter branch has 64 times the load-bearing capacity as a half-inch diameter branch. Try to bend a half-inch diameter branch, you can probably bend it pretty easily. Try to bend a 2-inch diameter branch, it's not so easy at all. And that's basically because the load-bearing capacity is a function of the diameter cubed. The load-bearing capacity also depends on wood strength. It's not as much of a factor as the diameter is, mostly because even the weakest wood is only about, let's say, 3 or 4 times weaker than the strongest wood that you're going to run into. So any change in diameter usually is going to kind of be much more important than different wood strengths. But if you're looking at the same diameter tree, obviously one that has stronger wood is going to have a greater load-bearing capacity. Decay is the best example of a defect to illustrate how the structural defects like decay or weak branches or cracks and those sorts of things, it's the best example of how a defect increases the likelihood of failure because it reduces the load-bearing capacity. And so here's a stem that has been mostly hollowed out. You can see that there's still some decayed wood just inside of the sound wood at the very outside of this cross section. When there's less wood, it means that even though you're looking at a 20-inch diameter cross section, it's really not 20 inches in diameter because most of that wood has been lost. So there'd be less load-bearing capacity. Even if this cross section were solid, decayed wood has much lower strength in it. And so even though it's a 20-inch diameter tree, if it were mostly decayed wood, that is not going to provide nearly the same amount of load-bearing capacity. So this becomes important, and I use decay as an example of defects because it's easy to see that in terms of how it affects the load-bearing capacity, how it reduces the load-bearing capacity. But decay is also something that can happen in the long term when we prune trees. So there is a potential impact of pruning, not just in how it changes the drag or the torque on a tree, but also how it potentially decreases the load-bearing capacity because of decay associated with pruning wounds. And so we'll talk about that once again at the end very, very quickly when we look at pruning. Anybody who's been outside on a windy day knows that the wind is not a constant. You can go stand in a wind tunnel and experience 20-mile-an-hour winds or 100-mile-an-hour winds, but it's basically a constant value. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't change at all. In real life, wind is what we call dynamic. It changes. The wind speed changes quite a bit, and it changes very quickly. So you'll experience a gust of wind if you're standing outside that may last 2 or 3 or 5 seconds, and then it's going to slow back down, and then there'll be a pause when it's not quite as gusty, as windy, and then a few seconds or maybe 10 or 15 seconds later, there'll be another gust of wind, and it'll gust again to 25 or 35 miles an hour. So wind is dynamic because the velocity changes over relatively short periods of time. The opposite would be something like snow or ice load building up on the branches of a tree. That could take hours before there's a meaningful amount of weight from the snow or ice. It doesn't change in a matter of seconds. It changes over a matter of hours. So that's not a dynamic load. That's what we call a static load. It doesn't change very much over a short period of time. Because wind is a dynamic load, we have to understand not just its speed, not just the velocity of the wind, but we also have to know about how the gusts occur with respect to time. And this is called the gust frequency. So it's basically how many seconds elapse between each gust of wind. And it usually is going to be relatively low. So that means it's usually going to be several seconds, 10, 15, 20 seconds between gusts of wind. This graph on the left side of the page is basically the measurement of wind speed over time. So this is actually from some research we did several years ago. We basically had motion sensors on trees to see how much they were moving during these windy events. And you can see on the vertical axis on the left-hand side of the screen, this is wind speed in miles per hour. So you've got up to 14 miles an hour. So some of these peak wind gusts here, that's what this purple line is tracking the speed of the wind. And this horizontal axis, you can see it's 120 seconds. So it's basically a 2-minute period of time. Here's a gust of wind that's, I don't know, maybe 11.5 miles per hour. Then a few seconds or 10 or 15 seconds later, here's another gust of wind that's a little bit more than 12 miles an hour. Then there's a pause. Here's a gust of wind that's only about 6 miles an hour. Then there's another pause. Here's another one at a little bit more than 12, maybe 13 miles per hour, pause, and et cetera. And so what you see here, you're actually looking at gusts of wind. You're looking at the speed of the wind changing over time. And so the gust frequency is how many of these gusts of wind occur in a certain amount of time. So we can count these. There's 7 of these gusts in the period of 120 seconds. If we divide 7 by 120, we get 0.06 gusts every second. So this is what I mean when I said in this previous slide, the gust frequency is typically low. It means that there's not very many wind gusts in a set amount of time. So in the case of 1 second, you're not going to get any. You're going to get 0.06 of a gust. It takes 2 minutes to get all 7 of these gusts going through. There's a black horizontal line across the center of this graph, basically, and that's the average wind speed for this 2-minute period. So when you look at a weather forecast and it says, winds 10 to 15 miles an hour with gusts up to 20 miles an hour, the 10 to 15 miles an hour, that's this average wind speed. But the reality is very, very different than that because you're getting a lot of this up and down motion. Those are the gusts of wind. And so the gust is going to be usually greater than the average, but you see there's one right down here at about 40 seconds, that's actually lower than the average for this 2-minute period. So this idea of how many gusts occur in a set period of time, gust frequencies, is another important basic physics concept we want to understand. So here's an illustration of gusts pushing on the tree. There's one, the first one, 11 miles an hour. Then there's a pause. Then there's another one, 12 miles an hour, the second gust. Then there's another pause. And obviously, you could keep doing this. You probably would end up slowing those animations down a little bit, but I don't want to waste too much time illustrating it. This is the idea that gusts of wind occur at intervals. It's not a constant force. The reason this is so important to understand the gust frequencies because, again, anybody who's watched trees moving around on a windy day, you know that the tree responds by swaying. So when the tree is exposed to that force of the wind, when the drag is pushing on that tree, it responds by swaying back and forth. That could be individual branches swaying, or if the wind is strong enough, it could be the whole trunk swaying back and forth. When we think about the tree responding to these wind gusts by swaying back and forth, we need to understand two important factors that are directly related to the tree itself. And so the first one is called the sway frequency. This is just like the gust frequency is how many gusts of wind in a certain amount of time. The sway frequency is just how many tree sways are there in a certain amount of time. The damping ratio is another factor, and it is a measure of basically how quickly the tree stops swaying. So if you imagine from that previous animation, like the gust of wind pushing on the tree, and then no more gusts of wind, how many seconds will that tree sway back and forth before it stops swaying? That's what the damping ratio is. In general, the sway frequency, a higher sway frequency means a lower likelihood of failure. It's actually part of a research project we did to measure how fast a tree sways back and forth after you prune it in certain ways. So in this particular case, we also wanted to see if I stayed up in the tree after pruning it, how would my weight in that tree affect the tree swaying back and forth. So we conducted a series of projects like this to try to illustrate the effect of pruning, but also if you're rigging a tree, and anybody who's taken the top out of a tree before knows that you could be going for a little bit of a ride if your ground workers haven't lowered it properly. So we want to see, does the tree respond to the weight of a climber as well? But this is basically an illustration of the sway frequency. How many sways per second? Here's the plot, okay, the graph of that tree swaying back and forth over time. So the horizontal axis on the bottom, there's an 18-second time period. And the sway motion is what this vertical axis is. You can see here's the tree swaying in one direction, then it goes back the other direction, back to the first direction, and so forth and so on. You can count pretty clearly there's 4 sways in 18 seconds. So the sway frequency for this particular tree is 4 divided by 18, 0.22 sways every second. And remember, the gust frequency was 0.06, so they're not really close, and that also has implications for tree failure. When the gust frequency is similar to the sway frequency, you have a much greater likelihood of failure. Most wind gusts, again, occur at a lower frequency. So 0.06 is a pretty low frequency. If the tree sway were closer to that value of 0.06, even if the velocity never changed, even if the wind didn't speed up, you would increase the likelihood of failure because the sway frequency and the gust frequency are similar. So I don't have time to go into the physics that's behind this, but you imagine pushing somebody in a swing when do you push that person to get them to move more, to swing more? You push them when they have reached their maximum backwards swing. You don't push them when they're, not right there, because you're going to be pushing air. And you certainly don't push them when they are still moving back towards you, because you're going to either push them off the swing or you're going to break your wrists. So you push them when they are at their maximum backward motion, just before they start going forward again. You can get them to swing higher and higher, more and more, even if you don't exert any more force. So even if the velocity of the wind never increases, if the sway frequency is close to the gust frequency, likelihood of failure increases. So we want, if pruning can change anything, we want sway frequency to be different than the gust frequency. Here's an animation showing gusts of wind at a very different frequency than the tree. The tree is swaying many more times for every gust of wind. And you can watch the tree is actually doing what I just described, basically swaying backwards when the wind goes to push on it. So when that happens, it's actually slowing the tree down. It's not going to keep the tree moving. That's going to decrease the likelihood of failure. So one last concept here on this idea of dynamic loads and the dynamic response of the tree, and that's this idea of damping ratio. So you could see wind pushes on the tree, drag pushes on the tree, and if nothing else acts on that tree, no other gust of wind comes by, the tree's going to sway back and forth. Eventually, it's going to stop swaying. That's what damping is. It's basically the dissipation of energy by the tree moving back and forth. And so when you have, for example, lots of leaves on the tree, when you have lots of branches on the tree, all of those factors increase the damping ratio, which means the tree is not going to sway very much after a gust of wind pushes on it. And this also, more damping means lower likelihood of failure. And this video will illustrate that. If you look closely at the video, you'll watch the trunk only moves a very little bit as we winch it and then let it go. The branches continue to sway for quite some time, but the trunk really only sways back and forth a handful of times. And the reason for that is because those branches are doing a really good job of dissipating the energy. They're moving so that the trunk doesn't move. You also notice that the branches aren't moving exactly the same. Some of them are going forward and back. Some of them are going backward and forward. Some of them are going up and down. Some of them are going down and up. So when branches move differently like that, that also increases the amount of damping on the tree. And more damping is good. More damping means lower likelihood of failure. Here's a plot, a graph of that tree we just looked at, swaying back and forth after we pulled on it with the winch and then released it. So again, we're looking at time on this horizontal axis. This is only 13 seconds. And the motion of the tree, the back and forth motion of the tree on the vertical axis, once again, you see this kind of up and down. You notice that within 13 seconds, that tree is basically stopped moving altogether. So that's really high damping ratio. If you were to do it, plot this same thing with the tree that I showed before that I was still in the tree, those trees basically kept moving, for like 45, 50 seconds, because you could see in the image there, in the video, there was no leaves on it. There was basically no branches on it. It was just a stick in the ground. And so there was not a lot to slow it down. It had low damping, which meant it would continue to sway. And that means gusts of wind potentially can keep pushing it and keep getting it to move back and forth. That increases likelihood of failure. So high damping ratio, lower likelihood of failure. So now, again, I apologize for going rather quickly, but that's basically a several semesters of engineering pushed into a really short time frame. That's if you understand those concepts, those physics concepts, that will give you a really good handle on how pruning can potentially affect likelihood of failure, because pruning potentially can affect the drag, the torque, the lever, the frequency, and the damping ratio. All of those things, and we've done a fair amount of work on this to give us some idea of what's going to happen when you prune a tree in a certain way and if you prune a certain amount. What hasn't really been done, and I'll reiterate this again at the end, is looking at both short-term and the long-term consequences of pruning. So pruning has effects in the short term, and most of the research that has been done by me and by lots of other people, most of it has only been short-term consequences of pruning, like driving that tree in the pickup truck, prune it, drive it again. That's, pruning, and like 5 minutes later, you're measuring the force on it again. That's a short-term consequence. Longer-term consequences are potentially just as important in terms of likelihood of failure, but there haven't been nearly enough long-term studies of how trees respond to pruning. So here are 3 common types of pruning. The branches that are highlighted in red are the branches that you would remove. I think probably most of you are quite familiar with these, so I won't spend too much time on it, but raising is the removal of lower branches from the crown of the tree to increase clearance below. Thinning is the removal of branches throughout the crown of the tree without changing the shape or the length and the width of the crown, but it does reduce the density of foliage and twigs. And then reduction pruning or reduced pruning is the shortening of branches, either to create clearance on the sides or create clearance above the crown of the tree. All of the research we've done, we've mostly focused on the typical amounts of pruning that an arborist would do. So, not removing more than 25% of the foliage, for example. In general, the more you prune, the more you're going to reduce drag and reduce torque. But as I said in the very beginning, we obviously have to balance the amount of mechanical benefit, so how much drag do we really want to reduce on this tree, versus the physiological stress we might do if we prune too much. So a very simple way of thinking about this is, if you really wanted to reduce the wind load on the tree, you would simply strip all the foliage off of it. And that would have an incredible amount of effect on reducing the drag, because imagine like a flagpole. If it's a windy day and there's a flagpole and there's no flag that's hanging on the pole, the flagpole isn't going to move very much at all. It actually doesn't have a lot of drag on it because it has a pretty aerodynamic shape. The same thing is true of like branches and twigs. They're mostly like little tiny flagpoles or big flagpoles. They don't experience a huge amount of drag. What really experiences drag in the crown of the tree is the leaves. So if you want to reduce drag, you should simply pull off every single leaf on the tree, and you're going to reduce the likelihood of failure by a lot. Unfortunately, since trees are biological organisms, as you know, if you take all those leaves off, you're probably going to kill the tree. If you don't kill it, you're definitely going to stress it out a lot, and that could cause it to have other kinds of problems. So unlike somebody who's designing a flagpole and trying to figure out how much drag it is when the wind is blowing on it, when you're dealing with trees, we can't ignore the biological reality of a living organism. Trees need leaves, so you can't prune so much out without stressing the tree physiologically or biologically. So the more you prune, the more you're going to reduce drag, but within the biological limits. When you prune in such a way that you decrease the height of the tree, you shorten the crown of the tree, then you're going to decrease torque on the tree as well, because you're shortening the lever, you're shortening the distance between the center of the crown and the ground. And in general, the more you prune out of a tree, depending on where you prune it from. So reducing, shortening branches is going to have a different effect than like lion's tailing or something. But generally, pruning is going to increase the sway frequency of the tree. And because a higher sway frequency is going to be less likely to interact with the low gust frequency, higher frequency means lower likelihood of failure. So here are the kind of short-term effects of pruning. All of them are positive, potentially, because we're going to decrease likelihood of failure. And we have to do it within the biological limits, obviously. So just to put some numbers, here's a tree that has experiences 200 pounds of drag. That's the grayish arrow on the left-hand side. And let's just pretend it's got 20 feet of lever. So the torque on this tree is 200 pounds times 20 feet, 4,000 foot-pounds of torque. So we're going to prune this tree. The first type of pruning is to reduce it. When we reduce it, we're pruning foliage out, so we're reducing the crown area. That means we're just, again, making up these numbers, but now there's only 100 pounds of drag. So we've cut the amount of drag in half. Because we shortened the branches by reduction pruning, we also lowered that lever. We brought the crown center down a little bit lower. So now the leverage is only 15 feet. And of course, now you multiply 100 times 15, and we've got 1,500 foot-pounds of torque. So we reduced both the drag, 200 pounds to 100 pounds, and we reduced the lever, 20 feet to 15 feet. Let's look at a different type of pruning. If we raise the crown of the tree, we can still reduce the drag. So we still changed the drag from 200 pounds down to 100 pounds of drag. We still cut the drag in half. But because of removal of the lower branches in the crown of the tree, the center of that crown actually got raised up. So it's now 25 feet from the ground. And even though we have reduced the total torque from 4,000 foot-pounds now to 2,500 foot-pounds, 100 pounds of drag times 25 feet of lever, it's not nearly as effective as reducing, because reducing not only cuts the drag in half, it also shortens the lever. And that means the torque is going to be proportionally less. The sway frequency is also related to the branch length in a very straightforward way. And you can demonstrate this by holding a string, tying a throw weight onto it, and just letting that throw weight kind of pendulum back and forth. The longer the length of string between your hand and the throw weight, the lower the frequency. It's going to take a longer time for that throw weight to pendulum back and forth. So if you're raising the crown like you're seeing on the right-hand image here, this is basically like holding a longer length of throw line between your fingers and the throw weight. It's going to be a lower swaying frequency. Lower sway frequency is bad because that brings the sway frequency closer to the wind frequency, the gust frequency. Remember, the gust frequency is always going to be pretty low. It's always going to be pretty low. So if you prune a tree, you generally don't want to make the sway frequency lower, because that's going to make it closer to the gust frequency. Whereas if you shorten the tree, if you reduce it, then again, imagine holding the throw weight in tied to a throw line, and instead of the length of throw line being 36 inches, make it 12 inches, and you'll see it'll pendulum back and forth much, much faster. It has a much higher sway frequency than a pendulum that has a long lever. So the shorter the branches, the higher the sway frequency. The longer the lever, the lower the sway frequency. Lower frequency is not good. It brings the tree closer to the gust frequency, which is usually going to be low. Faster sway frequency, lower likelihood of failure, because the wind gusts are usually going to be low frequency. So you want a tree that's going to sway back and forth faster, and it's not going to be affected by that swinging effect that we described. All of those effects on drag, on torque, and on sway frequency, all of those have been studied, and we've done some of that work. Others, you listened to Dr. Gilman this morning. He's done some of this work. All of those studies are short-term studies. They basically look at the tree before it's pruned, then prune it, and then test it again, usually within probably an hour or so, maybe even less than that. The long-term effects haven't really been studied nearly as carefully, and as a result, it's hard to know exactly how pruning is going to affect the tree in the long term. So, for example, depending on the species, depending on the growing conditions, depending on the type of pruning and how severely you prune a tree, the tree is going to regrow some amount. I mean, if you prune too much, obviously you're going to kill it. But if you prune within a reasonable amount, and the tree happens to be growing in really good conditions, and it's a species that grows vigorously, maybe within 2 or 3 or 5 years, that tree could have regrown back to a much denser or much taller tree if you don't continue to prune it at some interval. And if you don't go back and prune it again, now the likelihood of failure has gone back to what it was before you pruned it. It might even be a greater likelihood of failure because the tree could be that much bigger. So we don't have a lot of information on this. In terms of research data, we don't have a lot of information on how different species in different climates and different growing conditions might respond to different types of pruning or different severities of pruning. This is something that we definitely need to study more. The other thing, and this is, kind of tying back in this idea of load-bearing capacity. Remember, failure occurs when the loads exceed the load-bearing capacity. Pruning can also potentially affect the load-bearing capacity because certain types of pruning cuts, like reduction cuts, for example, are much more likely to lead to decay than a removal cut, because when a removal cut, the branch collar remains intact. The branch protection zone remains intact. But on a reduction cut, there is no branch protection zone because you're cutting the parent stem at that point. So if you were to repeatedly reduce a tree and that species or under those growing conditions, the tree wasn't good at compartmentalizing, you might cause a fair amount of decay to occur over time. So even if you have reduced the load on the tree, you reduce the torque, you reduce the bending moment, you reduce the drag and reduce the torque by reduction pruning. Over the course of years and years of doing this, if you cause too much decay to form, you might get that hollow cross section that we saw before, and the load-bearing capacity now is much less than it was before you started pruning the tree. So these are all things, again, that it's hard. There's a lot of moving parts in a biological organism like this. And without more research, it's really hard to know exactly what's going to happen. This is why your experience ends up being really important. And knowing how different species are going to respond to different pruning types in different growing conditions, that could help you decide whether reduction pruning is the right thing to do, even though in general, reduction pruning is going to decrease the torque and increase the frequency, which are both going to reduce the likelihood of failure more than something like thinning or raising would. But the long-term consequences are also really important. Unless you're going to keep really close tabs on that tree, you need to be thinking about what's going to happen in the long term as well. And it's also something that you definitely want to convey to your clients, so that they're aware of maybe the need to go back and prune a tree more frequently than they originally thought they were going to have to do if they want to maintain a lower likelihood of failure. So I'm going to pause here, leaving time for questions. We've got at least 15, 20 minutes, I think. So happy to answer those right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. That was a great talk and perfect timing. And yes, we do have some questions. So I will go ahead and begin with several questions. If you all have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A section of the agenda on the session. So, Dr. Kane, whatever happened to the International Tree Failure Database Program?
That's a good question. That is better addressed to someone like Jim Clark or Tom Smiley. And I've been in contact with both of them within the last 60 days, I think, asking that exact same question. So my understanding is that the International Tree Failure Database, which had previously been a pretty good source of looking at what kinds of trees failed and under what conditions, that the funding that the Forest Service, I think, had provided to kind of house it and provide a server and provide administrators to kind of work with it, I believe that funding has expired, and I believe that the database still exists, but it is pretty much out of date. Like, I don't think it's been updated in at least 5 or maybe even 6 or 7 years. I would contact either Jim Clark, Tom Smiley, or you might be able to get a hold of Larry Costello. Larry has retired. He ran the Western Tree Failure Database, and they still have a pretty active program. I actually just gave a talk for the Western chapter like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they still do their tree risk database meeting every year. So I know Larry is still involved in that. You could look up the University of California, Davis extension, and you might be able to find Larry's contact, or Catherine Jones, or the person who replaced Larry. His name is Igor, Igor, and I think his last name is spelled Lacan. You could probably find his email address to ask that question.
Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure you're sharing your screen so we can see your face, and sharing your presentation. That way we can see you.
So it says I'm still screen sharing, and it says
yeah, end your screen share, I think, and that way we'll be able to see you. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Next question. What's the relationship between damping ratio and sway frequency and correlate? You may have already answered that, but you may want to touch on it.
There is a mathematical relationship between damping ratio and sway frequency, and it's going to be a little bit tricky in terms of distinguishing them. Basically, the frequency that I was showing you, so those sways back and forth and all those graphs I was showing, that's something called the damped natural frequency of the tree. So you can't easily separate damping ratio from the frequency, because it's obviously they're interconnected, because the tree is moving, but then it stops moving. So the thing you want to remember about those two factors is that both of them interact to either increase or decrease the likelihood of failure when there's a wind load on the tree. The best thing to do, and I don't have a good slide of it readily at hand, but if you do an image search online for the phrase dynamic amplification, you'll find a really nice graph that illustrates how the sway frequency, the gust frequency, and the damping ratio all kind of interact to basically increase the likelihood of failure. The other word you might look up is called resonance. And so when the wind frequency and the sway frequency are very similar, you get a phenomenon that's called resonance, and it causes the tree to kind of sway back and forth really, really violently, even if the wind speed doesn't change, because the sway frequency and the gust frequency are similar. On a structure that doesn't have a high damping ratio, you'll get this phenomenon of resonance. Damping basically counteracts the effect of sway frequencies and gust frequencies being similar, but some structures have different damping ratios. So it's, you have to look at all three factors at the same time, basically.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, let's move on to the next one. Should a defect be rated as to the likelihood of failure or the severity of damage that might result, or the event that would cause the failure?
So this is a good question that relates directly to the likelihood of failure. And the ISA, as you probably know, has a tree risk assessment qualification. If you take the training for that and become a qualified risk assessor, what you'll learn is that defects do have a severity, and severe defects are going to reduce the load-bearing capacity of the tree much more than a defect that is not so severe. So just returning to the defect of decay, you can imagine that if you have a 20-inch diameter tree and it has like a 5-inch column of decay right in the center of it, yes, that is a defect, but it doesn't meaningfully reduce the load-bearing capacity because it's such a small amount and it's right in the center of the tree. If you took that same 20-inch diameter tree and you had an 18-inch column of decay, so pretty much the entire cross-section except for the very outer wood fibers is decayed, now you have a much greater likelihood of failure because the load-bearing capacity of that stem has been dramatically reduced by all that decay. And whether it's a completely hollow stem or even if it's just decayed wood that basically has like no more strength in it, that's gonna reduce the load-bearing capacity by quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on. How much does soil texture and moisture affect the stability in a wind event, especially heavy winds following a heavy rainfall, for instance?
There's a huge effect of both of those factors, and I'm not an expert in soil mechanics or root mechanics for that matter, but the general rule of thumb is that so let's imagine a tree uprooting. The ways a tree can uproot is by either the roots breaking, and that would be the load-bearing capacity of the roots couldn't handle the amount of load that the wind imparted to that tree. So the roots literally like snap in half. But the other ways that the tree can uproot have to do with the interaction of the soil and the roots. And so even if the roots themselves don't actually break, they can pull out of the soil. They can basically just, the roots slide relative to the soil and the tree can be completely uprooted. So I'm sure many of you have seen that sort of an effect. That's where soil texture and soil moisture content are incredibly important, because if you have a really sandy soil, for example, it's really easy to pull the roots through that sandy soil. Whereas if you have a very clay soil, there's a lot more friction between the tree roots and the soil particles themselves. So it's much harder to uproot a tree in a heavy clay soil because of that friction. But when you add moisture, that reduces the friction between the roots and the soil particles. So even if it's a very heavy clay soil, if it's waterlogged, there's going to be very little friction between those roots and the soil particles, and it's much more likely to uproot at that point. So the soil texture and the moisture content are probably the two most important factors in terms of uprooting of a tree. It's unless the roots have decay in them or they've been cut, it's really unlikely that the roots themselves are going to break. Like, you don't see a lot of big structural roots on trees that have failed unless they've been cut, unless there's decay. It's much more likely that the smaller diameter roots are going to fail, but they're failing basically because they're pulling out of the soil and eventually they just have to snap. It's the lack of friction between the roots and the soil particles that can cause that type of uprooting.
That's really interesting, and that kind of brings up a question for me. And this isn't from the audience, but for me. But we often, in my field, and I'm in the utility arboriculture field, and so we end up having to do some severe pruning a lot of times because of where the tree is located next to the power line. And so oftentimes we get comments from the customers like, okay, now the tree's going to fall over because you've trimmed so much off the top of the tree.
Right.
And so we kind of have to talk about, well, the roots are still intact. We have not touched the roots. And so the likelihood of failure because of what we've done up top is not founded. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right about that, Ann. And like just in general, with utility pruning, with any type of pruning, again, the more you prune, the more you're going to reduce the drag. The issue is whether the pruning you do increases that lever on the crown of the tree. But if you're even pruning and raising, the diagram I showed before, you're still going to reduce the likelihood of failure, even if you make the crown higher up. If you prune a lot, you're still going to reduce the drag on that tree. And so unless you're going in cutting the roots, or unless there's a huge amount of soil moisture, or it's a really, really sandy soil, you're not likely to have above ground effects in the uprooting of the tree. You have to damage the roots for that to happen, or to have a really bad hurricane.
Yeah, and that's kind of our message. It's not likely. All right, moving on to a question from the audience. Are there certain trees that are naturally stronger and have less risk problems?
Really good question. So species is definitely a factor. Many research studies have looked at trees that failed or didn't fail during some sort of storm event. So it's usually looking like hurricanes, and a lot of them have been done in the tropics and subtropics, but there's plenty of examples of ice storms and snowstorms also causing failures. The effect of species is there's a lot of effects of species. The first is that the wood strength is definitely a factor. So if you have two branches that are the same diameter, if you have a strong wooded tree, it has a lower likelihood of failure than a weak wooded tree. The second factor is that some species are more prone to defects. So certain species are more prone to form weak branch unions. Certain species are more or better able to compartmentalize decay, where other species decay is much more likely to occur, and the species are not good compartmentalizers. In both of those cases, those defects are going to reduce the likelihood of failure. Certain species will grow in such a way just naturally that they have lower drag coefficients. So for example, species like honey locust that have a really kind of porous or not very dense crown, those species it's easier for wind to pass through them. So even if they have the same amount of area, because they're so porous, as it were, gusts of wind can more easily move through them. So the species is a huge factor for all of those reasons. And when you look at failed and standing trees following storms, species, the rate of failure or the likelihood of failure is almost always affected by the size of the tree and the species of the tree, and if there are severe defects, by the presence of those defects.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, next question. Please talk about the mechanical effects on perimeter trees versus those in the center.
Okay, excellent question. So this is the loads a tree experiences. And so trees that are, foresters have been studying this for many, many years. Trees that are growing on the inside of a forest stand, they are exposed to almost no drag because all of the trees around them shelter them from the force of the wind. If you, especially on like a new development where a lot is cleared in a forest stand, and now all of those trees that previously hadn't been exposed to winds, they're now getting exposed. They haven't been able to grow in such a way to bear or to withstand those new loads that they're exposed to. So this is one of the classic situations when you have an increase in the likelihood of failure is exposing a tree to loading that it didn't previously experience. There's a concept, sometimes we call it response growth, sometimes it's called adaptive growth, but basically the idea is that trees have evolved to grow wood in such a way that it minimizes their likelihood of failure under a certain set of growing conditions. So if those growing conditions change, if a tree that had previously been sheltered all of a sudden is exposed to very high winds, it hasn't grown in such a way to manage those, to be able to deal with those new forces. So it's going to be much more likely to fail. And trees that are on the perimeter, they've been exposed to the winds the entire time, so they have grown in such a way that they can manage, they can bear those loads of wind or whatever it happens to be. I mean, even snow and ice loads in a boreal forest where the taller trees basically catch all of the snow. The trees that are in the understory don't get as much snow building up on them. So if you remove the overstory or the canopy trees, all of a sudden these small trees are going to be exposed to all this snow, and chances are pretty good they're going to start losing a lot of branches or maybe fail completely.
Thank you. That was great. Appreciate it. Okay, the last one is more of a comment than a question. Obviously, lion's tailing decreases dampening and raises the likelihood of failure. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but there was a comment.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. So I'll say again that, and we've actually Tom Smiley and I did some tests on this. Lion's tailing decreases the drag because you're actually pruning quite a bit of foliage out of it. So it decreases the drag. It doesn't tend to decrease the torque because it doesn't really lower the crown. If anything, it kind of makes the crown a little bit higher because all the foliage now is at the ends of the branches. The one thing that lion's tailing tends to do that is bad, in addition to all the, like, physiologically, it's not a good thing to do, but in terms of likelihood of failure, what it does is it actually changes what's likely to fail. And so if you lion's tail a tree, you're much more likely to have individual branches failing rather than the whole tree failing, because what happens is that the lever on each individual branch is much, much longer since you've pruned out or stripped out all of the interior foliage along that branch. Now the wind, the drag, is only going to act at the very, very end of that branch. So you're much more likely to get that part of the branch snapping off in a windstorm. The other thing that kind of compounds that problem is if the tree continues to be lion's tailed, there's going to be really, really narrow taper in those branches. So they're going to be really long and spindly, just like the trees, in the interior of a forest stand that haven't been exposed to loads. They're really long and spindly. When you lion's tail, you do that same thing. And so even if the tree doesn't lose branches like, the first year you lion's tail it, if you keep doing that for 5 or 10 years, and then all of a sudden you get a big windstorm, pretty much all of those branches have a really high likelihood of failing out where the taper is really the narrowest, because that's where the load bearing capacity is going to be the least.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Kane. We really appreciate you joining us today on our first ever virtual Think Trees conference. We're hoping the audience members did learn a lot and got a lot out of this presentation today. And so I am going to show the CEUs, but we will say goodbye to Dr. Kane, and thank you so much.
Take care, Ann. Good to see you. Bye, everybody.
Good to see you. And I will share the screen with the codes here. We'll leave it up hopefully long enough for you to jot it down. All right, and there you go. So the ISA code is RM-21-028. The NMLA code is LA-0002. Again, you can find the CEU forms in the Whova app on the left-hand side. If you fill it out, send it to, I mistakenly gave you the Think Trees website last time. It should be the Think Trees email, which is thinktreesnm@gmail.com, I believe. Andrew is going to come on now, and he is going to wrap up our conference for the day. I want to thank you for your attention, and we really appreciate you all being here. Andrew.
Greetings all, and I think I'm on. Can you hear me?
Gotta stop sharing. Hold on, let me see.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, great. I'll just jump on while the CEU slide is up. I was very impressed with today, and I really got to thank Dr. Gilman and Dr. Kane for sharing. We are very fortunate to get speakers of this quality to join and share with us. I just want to make a few closing remarks. I know there's been some difficulty getting on, registering today, and maybe even getting into the CEUs. But here's some notes, just as a reminder. For NMDA and SAF, simply download and fill out the appropriate forms found in Whova under CEU forms. You do not need CEU codes like ISA and New Mexico Association of Landscape Architects require. Fill those out, and as like Ann said, email them back this week or next week to thinktreesnm@gmail.com. All that information is in Whova. I'd like to remind you all to visit the sponsors as you see around me, and just pay a visit to them and a thank you. Tomorrow, we're going to transition into climate, drought, and glyphosate. Kind of sounds like a new Netflix series, but it actually is Think Trees. I want to thank you all for attending, and we will see you all tomorrow, 9 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. Hasta luego.